Good afternoon or good morning from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Ashley Fortune Isham, and I am very happy to welcome you all to our webinar series that's held in partnership with the USGS National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center that's located in Reston, Virginia. So the NCC-WSC Climate Change Science and Management webinar series highlights their sponsored science projects related to climate change impacts and adaptation, and aims to increase awareness and inform participants like you about the potential and predicted climate change impacts on fish and wildlife. So I would like to introduce Dr. Sean Carter, Senior Scientist at the NCC-WSC. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and delighted to introduce our next three speakers. Megan Kreutzberg is a researcher at the Institute for Natural Resources in Portland, Oregon, which is affiliated with Portland State University and Portland and Oregon State University. She is interested in landscape scale conservation and management, and her current research uses simulation models to understand the impacts of disturbances, climate change, and management. She works in varied ecosystems throughout the western U.S., from coastal forests to subalpine forests and rangelands, and she received her PhD from Utah State University in 2010. Jennifer Costanza is a landscape ecologist with research interests in ecological effects of global change, land change modeling, and landscape conservation. She received her PhD in ecology from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she's currently a research assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. Much of her research involves investigating future forest dynamics across the U.S. in response to changes in climate, disturbances, land use, and land management. And then last but not least, Brian Miller is a research scientist at the Natural Resource Ecology Lab at Colorado State University and is also a staff member at the Department of Interior's North Central Climate Science Center, so he's one of our own. He's working with the NCCSC staff and partners to develop simulation and scenario planning tools that can help resource managers deal with climate change, and is also helping to manage capacity building projects in the North Central domain. Brian earned his degree in ecology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill as well, and he's also worked at the Carolina Population Center. So it's my pleasure to introduce these three speakers. I believe we're going to be starting off with Brian, who I'm going to turn it over to now. Welcome.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Sean, for the introduction, and also thank you to Holly and Ashley for helping to organize today's webinar. And of course, thanks to everybody else on the line listening in. So we're going to break things up today into three different case studies. But before we kind of jump into the details there, what I'm going to do is give everybody an overview of state and transition modeling and also how climate change is now being sort of brought into those models. And that's to get everybody on the same page. And then we'll get into those three different case studies. So the first being a case study on whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem that I'll be talking about. Then we'll hear from Jen Costanza about longleaf pine, and finally from Megan Kreutzberg about rangeland condition and greater sage-grouse. And so each of these case studies kind of brings something a little bit different to the table in terms of integrating climate change into state and transition simulations, along with other dynamics like urbanization and fire and things like that. So just to give you an idea of where we'll be traveling today, at least virtually, I'll be starting off here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, right at the intersection of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And then we'll hear from Jen in the southeastern United States, and then Megan back over on the west coast in southeastern Oregon. So what are state and transition models? Initially, and to some extent continuing through today, they're used as conceptual models. So ways of organizing our thinking about vegetation and how it can change through time and space. And this is oftentimes represented in this sort of box and arrow diagram kind of approach, where the boxes represent the states and the arrows the transitions. And so what do we mean when we say states and transitions? And one thing I'd point out is this does vary quite a bit, especially with the term states. It does depend on your objectives, what you're trying to model and understand, and also what data you have available and what level of detail those data are. But essentially, they're sort of groups of vegetation communities, and they're oftentimes defined by a dominant cover type. So in my case, there might be whitebark pine forest. A structural stage, so often with forests, that might be, say, open versus closed or somewhere in between. And then an age, and this could be a numerical kind of an age, or maybe it's relative to, say, reproductive status or something like that. Transitions are really any kind of process that has a bearing on that vegetation and that you're interested in. And here I've kind of given a couple examples of some natural and anthropogenic types of transitions, although clearly there's some overlap there, and those categories are not necessarily mutually exclusive or so distinct. But this gives you a little flavor of the types of transitions you can include in these models, and you'll be seeing a variety of these through the case studies. So again, I've just put this definition of state and transition models up here, and I'm going to leave it there for a moment while I define one other part of this, the title of the slide here. So I've talked about state and transition models, but what do I mean when we insert the word simulation? So simulations, there's a variety of different kinds of simulations, but really they're any kind of computer-based representation of the real world. Think SimCity is maybe one that some people might be familiar with. It gives you an idea of what we mean. But sort of the benefit of simulations, I would say, is kind of twofold. For one thing, they can really represent complex interactions that we see in the real world, so nonlinearities and thresholds, secondary effects, or what you might think of as feedbacks, and also emergent patterns. So these are sort of more complicated-looking patterns that emerge from very simple rules. For instance, things like bird flocking or fish schooling behavior. And then, not only can we kind of recreate these dynamics, which is neat, and it helps us understand how systems work, but we can then kind of use those simulations as a virtual laboratory. So we can ask what-if questions that we might not be able to ask in the real world. So what if we increase the area burned each year through time, or something like that. So they're really helpful for kind of digging into management-relevant questions. And so together, state and transition simulation models, that whole term, essentially we're taking this box and arrow kind of conceptual model and making it temporally dynamic, and in many cases, although not always, spatially explicit. And as a result, we're able to represent biotic interactions, disturbances, and management scenarios within this framework. And to give you a more concrete idea of what I mean, I'm just going to briefly talk about a simple example model before we dive into the more complicated case studies. So here's just a three-state kind of example, an open forest class, a closed forest class, and finally some kind of, maybe there's an invasive species that can invade this forest. And we have some different transitions. There's succession, fire, invasion, restoration. So giving you a flavor of the states and transitions you might be interested in. And so then you might imagine a gridded landscape. So those that are familiar with raster images, satellite images, you could think of each cell on the landscape existing in one of these three states at any given time. And then that cell can transition to one of the other states depending on how you set up your transitions, and whether those are based on an age or a probability or something along those lines. So to give you a little visual, here's just an example image, the three colors representing three different states. And then you could imagine this kind of changing over time. So for instance, the purple being an invasive species, you might then see that move across the landscape and have some kind of management intervention that limits that spread. So that's just a basic example, and one that I pulled from the state and transition simulation modeling software, STSM, that I believe all of us use. So to summarize, state and transition simulations can integrate these different dynamics really effectively, and they've been shown to be able to do that. And today, I think one of the bigger challenges that is really being worked on currently is how to bring climate into this picture. And so through the different case studies, we're going to give you some examples of how that can be done. So we're really going to hone in on this connection here. So again, now to bring you back to these more specific case studies, here's our map again. I'm going to start off with whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And before I dive in, I did just want to mention some collaborators on this project who are listed here at the bottom of the slide. Leonardo Frid, Tony Chang, Nate McKellick, Andy Hansen, and Jeff Morris that have been helping with this work. So whitebark pine is a native conifer of the western United States, primarily in the subalpine, and it's considered a keystone species because it provides food for various wildlife, Clark's nutcracker, red squirrels, and grizzly bears. And it also serves some ecosystem functions of stabilizing soil and moderating snowmelt and runoff, and also facilitating the establishment of other species. But it has been affected pretty dramatically in recent years primarily by two disturbance agents, one being a non-native fungal pathogen called white pine blister rust, and the other being the more infamous mountain pine beetle that also affects trees like lodgepole pine and ponderosa pine. And so we've seen some dramatic declines in whitebark over the last couple of decades, and now sort of the question is, well, how might climate further affect whitebark, and how might it affect it indirectly through these different disturbance agents? So again, returning to this idea of connecting climate and state and transition simulations, the approach that we've taken is to sort of bridge these two using species distribution models. So now I'm going to give you just a small bit of background on species distribution models, and then get back to this specific example. So species distribution models essentially correlate a set of abiotic variables, so climate variables, soil, what have you, with species occurrence, and this can be species presence or species presence and absence. And it's a bit of a misnomer because it's not necessarily telling you where you will find a species in the future. It doesn't project species distributions, but rather it models projected suitable areas based on those abiotic variables. So in our case, our abiotic variables included predictor data from the PRISM dataset, as well as some water balance modeling. And these are summarized monthly using means from 1950 to 1980. And through this collection of predictors, we then had a large number, 122 predictor covariates. And so we needed to narrow that down in order to reduce collinearity. So we chose among pairs of variables with the highest levels of correlation to reduce that collinearity. And we selected variables that explained a high amount of deviance in presence and absence, and also were ecologically meaningful to whitebark ecology. So we ended up with, through this process, a total of 8 predictor variables, as well as our set of presences and absences. And we could then relate these two sort of data sets, you might say, through a random forest modeling algorithm. And then we ran the model for a historical time period and also projected it into the future. And so for the projections, we relied on primarily 2 global circulation models, as well as 2 representative concentration pathways. And I should add that in Tony Chang and Andy Hansen's work, they've explored a variety of other RCPs and GCMs. But for this work, we kind of just chose to select sort of the bookends of the most and least impact on whitebark pine habitat suitability. So the output of these models is really, I think, the thing that I'd like you to focus on here. So the output of the models looks something like this. It's a gridded image here where each cell has a probability of presence of whitebark pine based on those abiotic variables. So in this case, red being a higher probability of presence, blue being the lowest. And just keep this image in mind. It'll come back in about 2 slides or so. So when we then turn to the state and transition simulation, if we just look at sort of the core of it, the most basic portion of this model, you can think of sort of 3 states. There's an open state, which could be a shrub herb state or maybe an alpine area where there is no whitebark yet. And seeds can then disperse to that location. But we then need to determine whether or not a seed could feasibly establish at that location on the landscape. And so you can oftentimes you'll do this through probabilities. But in our case, what we did was we brought in that species distribution model output to dictate those probabilities through space, and then we could also allow those probabilities to change through time with a changing climate. And so in essence, the species distribution model output serves as a spatial multiplier effect for whether or not seedlings are able to establish. And so I don't want to bore you too much with this figure, but I did just want to mention briefly that those 3 boxes and arrows is just one portion of the broader model that includes other dynamics, including aging, fire, mountain pine beetle infection, blister rust, and competition with other species. And so one thing that was important for us to do, as I said, is to run the model historically and then compare the model specifications to observations. So we pulled some data from the aerial detection survey about whitebark pine mortality from mountain pine beetle, and that's represented by the black solid line here. And then the dashed lines are different model specifications, and the gray line there at the bottom is sort of a no climate change scenario. And you can see that we're not only kind of ending up at a location where, this specification is really closely matching observations, but we're also reproducing that temporal signature as well. So we felt fairly confident, at least for this kind of way of demonstrating this integration of tools, to move forward and look at projections as well. So I'm just going to show sort of 2 quick results here. One, if we were to look just at whitebark pine sort of beetle kill stands through time, you might say, oh, well, this is kind of encouraging. Looks like there's a peak in beetle kill, maybe early-ish in the 21st century that tails off, and this tails off sort of across the different colors, which represent different climate change scenarios. But if we look more carefully at whitebark on the landscape, we're seeing a fairly consistent decline through time, and by the time we get to 2100, late cereal stage whitebarks, so sort of more mature whitebark pine stands, are nearly absent from the landscape in all of these climate projections. And so I should add, this is a bit of a way, again, of demonstrating the methods, but it's a work in progress. We have a paper forthcoming describing this work, but we're continuing to explore other disturbance agents and also management scenarios. So again, our approach was to use species distribution models to bridge climate science and state and transition simulations. And not only is this only one way of doing so, but we see this as being part of a broader suite of tools that we can use to really make the simulation modeling relevant to managers. So it's not just modeling for modeling's sake, but maybe we can bring in scenario planning and social science to really tune these things in to meet management needs. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jen Costanza and let her talk about her case study.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I'll be talking about longleaf pine in the southeast U.S. right now. I'm going to focus on some work we've done recently to explore some scenarios of urbanization, climate change, and fire management. And here's our study area, which is kind of at the intersection of Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. And again, this work was done with funding from the Southeast Climate Science Center. Just a little background before I get into our modeling project on the longleaf pine ecosystem. So longleaf pine woodlands or savannas kind of look like this picture on the left, fairly open canopy with a thick understory of grasses and herbaceous species and a fairly open shrub layer, or virtually no shrubs present, at least under historical conditions. Under pre-settlement, these woodlands and savannas would have been burned as frequently as every 1 to 3 years to keep this open structure. And this open structure supports not only a high diversity of plants in the understory and some of the highest diversity of understory plants anywhere in the world, and also supports a variety of wildlife, including the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker. And longleaf pine would have existed across this range, the range map you see here. This is a range of longleaf pine trees, but this longleaf pine ecosystem would have existed in sort of vast expanses across this range historically. And now some estimates put the range of the longleaf pine ecosystem at about 3% of what it had been. So it's highly fragmented and severely reduced in range. And the places that haven't been converted to agriculture and to other human land uses look like this picture on the bottom here. They're pretty closed in. The understory maybe full of shrubs, and the rich herbaceous species may be gone, and the canopy may be more closed. That's mostly due to fire suppression, which has been fairly predominant over the last century or more in this ecosystem. And so in efforts to try to think about conservation and restoration of the ecosystem, this report came out in 2009, and there's been a working group associated with this ongoing, and some efforts ongoing. But this report, this range-wide conservation plan for longleaf pine, set forth a couple of goals, a couple of major goals. One was to increase the total area of the longleaf pine ecosystem by 135%. And the other one is to double the area of this open canopy fire-maintained longleaf state. And so this report also set forth kind of two methods to do that. One was to focus on maintaining open stands by burning, keeping fire in these open stands. The second method was to then secondarily improve stands that had been degraded, or restore stands that had been converted to agriculture, or maybe loblolly pine plantations, which are big here. And so our research question for this work really focused on that, on those goals in that report, and looked at whether over the next century, whether those goals for longleaf pine could be met or would be met under scenarios of changing climate, urbanization, and then given potential feasible management scenarios in the future. And so again, we used the state and transition simulation model approach. We built on the wealth of models that have been developed by the Landfire, or under the Landfire program a few years back. This is, if you all aren't familiar with them and are interested in doing this type of modeling, I highly suggest checking these out. There's one for every ecological system in the U.S., and they do focus on pre-European settlement dynamics. And so we use the model for longleaf pine, and then we changed it to reflect current and then future conditions. And so here's the basic structure of the model. Brian did a great job of outlining sort of the overall setup of these state and transition models. But for longleaf pine, we have kind of two successional pathways. A stand starts out in early succession, and that represents 0 to 14 years of age. And the normal successional pathway brings that stand to an open canopy state in mid-succession for 15 to 74 years, and then to late succession open after 75 years. And then there's an alternative succession pathway that brings the stand to similar closed late and mid states. And I'll add in the probabilistic transitions under fire. So there are several kinds of fire that can occur in this system, and under this model, a replacement fire would bring any of these states back to early succession. A mixed fire would bring a closed stand to an open condition, and surface fires act to maintain that open condition. And there are probabilities associated with these. They're annual probabilities, and there are also time steps in between them, such that you can or cannot. There are the constraints where these fires may or may not be experienced in any given year. But we again updated this model to reflect current conditions by gathering data, data on recent wildfires in the region where we were working. And so you can see here, here's the updated wildfire probabilities. I mentioned earlier that an open canopy state under pre-settlement may have experienced fire every 1 to 3 years. And here we're seeing, according to the recent wildfire data, 0.02 annual probability, which is, translates to a fire every 50 years. So severe fire suppression, as I mentioned, is reflected in the data that we were able to gather on this. The second update we did was to adjust all of these probabilities for climate change, so all the fire probabilities. Here we're focusing on fire's effect or climate change's effect on fire. There have been a lot of studies recently done suggesting that the range of longleaf pine might not be affected, at least in our study area, by climate change. It actually might do better under climate change because it's resistant to drought, the species itself. But the effect of climate on fire was what we were interested in examining. And so we did that by gathering historic climate records and then using that same wildfire record for the area. And we related recent area burned per month to some climate variables. There are both temperature and precipitation related variables, and they also looked at different lag times. So how hot has it been, or how hot is it, and how hot has it been in the recent past, and then how wet is it, and how wet has it been in the recent past. And so we did that on a monthly basis, and got a time series regression relationship. And then that was based on recent data, and then we used that same relationship to project then what future fires, how much area would be burned under future climate. We did that using downscale climate projections done by Catherine Hayhoe for a number of GCMs under 2 emission scenarios, the A1FI, which is the high emission scenario, and the B1, which is the lower emission scenario. And then we translated that into what we call a fire multiplier, which is just the ratio of recent fire or area burned to future area burned. And you see that relationship for the A1FI here. And this is the distribution. Since we had multiple GCMs, we did a probabilistic distribution into the future. So the middle line here is the mean, and then you see the min and the max for every year. And so we were able to sample across that distribution to get a series of multipliers, and we did that 50 times so we could run our simulation model, 50 Monte Carlo simulations. But you see, I do want to point out that even under this high emission scenario, the projection is that close to 1, meaning no change in fire and just a slight increase maybe over time in fire under that scenario. The second thing, or the third thing we did is to add urbanization to this state and transition model. And so we had the possibility of any of these state classes transitioning to an urban class. And we did that based on some recent work, recent projections of urbanization we did for the Southeast. Here you see the orange is the current urban area, urban footprint, and the red is the projected future urban footprint. And we also, this is based on a cellular automaton model called Sleuth. And Brian mentioned the spatial multiplier. We also incorporated this time series of future projections as spatial multipliers in our modeling. But for our study area, it worked out to be about a 0.0018 annual probability of urbanization. So once we had the urban and the climate change added, we needed to look at some management scenarios. And based on that range-wide conservation plan for longleaf pine, we identified some of the most likely management actions in the ecosystem. And the focus in that report was on maintaining open longleaf. And so that was one of the management actions we added to the state and transition model, and that just acted to keep open, mid and late open state classes in their current states. We also added an option to improve closed stands to open. So this is kind of like the mixed wildfire, but it also takes into account a series of management type burns and thinning actions done. That's kind of the state of the art in terms of the latest thinking on how to transition closed longleaf to open longleaf. And then there was the option to restore longleaf from planted pine or agriculture, and that again represented a series of management actions, including cutting planted pine and then planting longleaf, etc. And so this is our modified state and transition simulation model. And And so we ran this for 14 scenarios. We wanted to again look at the influence of urbanization, climate, and management. And so at the top two boxes here represent scenarios that incorporated climate change only, but no management, and with and without urbanization. And then we added four management regimes, and we used the A1FI climate scenario in those. And again, we have without urban and with urbanization. And our management scenarios, again incorporated those three management actions that I showed on the previous slide. Two of our scenarios incorporated maintenance burning only, so maintaining open longleaf only at a level similar to current levels in the landscape, based on some management records that we had for the landscape, and then doubling the management level, so still maintaining only open longleaf, but doubling that amount that gets managed every year, and then a portfolio of management actions, which included all three of those actions that I discussed previously, but with both a level that reflects current levels and then twice current levels. And so that was our 14 scenarios, and we mapped the whole our whole ecoregion that we were working in. We mapped the longleaf, agriculture, planted pine, and urban areas for the initial landscape, and we labeled all of the longleaf with one of those 5 state classes. And then we ran that simulation model on an annual time step through 2100 for all 14 scenarios. And here's a look at the kinds of results we got. This is those 5 longleaf state classes over time. The blues are the open canopy, and the reds are the closed canopy. And so you see, if you look at this top line and the first 2 scenarios here, so these first 6 scenarios just include climate without management. You see that essentially you get a buildup of these red classes, these closed canopy classes. That's because even with climate change, there's still fire suppression is still so high in this landscape that you get a buildup of these classes. And you also see that there was no difference among no substantial difference in the result among the different climate scenarios. So without climate, with the B1 and the A1FI, you still get this buildup of the closed canopy. With management, any scenario with management, so any of the other scenarios did better than the ones without management in terms of the amount of open canopy that resulted toward the end of the simulation period. And then the scenarios that included a portfolio of management, so that included the restoration of non-longleaf to longleaf, increased the total area of longleaf. And here, just briefly as kind of a different way to look at the results, relating them directly to that range-wide plan for conservation. And this is plotting the end result, so the result in 2100. And this is the change in total area of longleaf along the x-axis, and the change in area of open longleaf along the y-axis for all 14 of those scenarios. Each scenario is represented by a dot or a triangle. The triangles are with urbanization, and the dot is without urbanization. And here you see the scenario names along the right, kind of corresponding to the colors. So the first thing to notice is that all of the climate change scenarios, again, don't show any significant or substantial difference from one another. They're kind of stacked up here. But they do worse. They have a decrease in the area of open longleaf, and they don't do any better in terms of the total area of longleaf. All of the management scenarios did better. And then I put the conservation goal of doubling the area of open longleaf here on this slide, and you can see that the management portfolio, when the management effort is doubled, the scenarios with the management portfolio far exceed that conservation goal, and one of these other maintenance-only results does as well. But none of the scenarios meet that second conservation goal. That conservation goal would be out here, increasing the total area of longleaf by 135%. So none of them came close to that. In some, we're seeing that climate scenarios aren't really affecting the results. Climate change didn't have really that substantial of an effect on our fire regime here, but management scenario and urbanization do affect the results, and that no scenario we examined was able to meet both of those conservation goals. So with that, I'll pass this over to Megan, who is going to bring us back west and talk about sage-grouse habitat.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so I'm Megan Kreutzberg. I'm going to be presenting the third case study on rangeland condition and sage-grouse habitat. And this work was funded by the Northwest Climate Science Center. So first, to get a little context on the rangelands in eastern Oregon, for those of you that aren't familiar with this ecosystem. The region is dominated by sagebrush steppe, and there are various management challenges that we're facing in this area. In the warmer, drier region, exotic grasses such as cheatgrass have invaded large areas and have promoted this frequent fire cycle, causing a shift from native perennial shrub steppe to annual grasslands. In the cooler, more moist areas, there's a very different problem where western juniper, which is actually native to eastern Oregon, is expanding into areas historically occupied by shrub steppe and changing it from shrub steppe to woodland. And then, of course, we also know that climate change is already and will cause increasing changes in temperature and precipitation patterns. And then looming over all of this in the sagebrush steppe throughout the West is the greater sage-grouse, which is a sagebrush obligate species that's been declining for several decades throughout its range and actually will be considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act in just a few months here. So the objectives for this work are to model vegetation change into the future under varying scenarios of climate and management, and then interpret implications for both vegetation condition and sage-grouse habitat. So to address these questions, we integrated three types of models. First, my colleague Emily Henderson built a sage-grouse species distribution model, shown there in the lower left, which basically defined a rule set relating environmental variables to sage-grouse presence in the region. And we integrated this rule set into the MC2 dynamic global vegetation model to track vegetation that is climatically unsuitable for sage-grouse. So the MC2 model projects broad-scale changes in the distribution of plant functional types, carbon, nutrient pools and fluxes, and also wildfire. And it can project future conditions under scenarios of climate change. So it's a mechanistic model. So from MC2, and also integrating this species distribution model rule set, we incorporated changes in the distribution of these plant functional types and wildfire into a set of state and transition simulation models, which have been introduced in the last two talks. And so, again, these model succession, disturbances, and management at finer scales than the MC2 models, so they're more applicable for management questions. So incorporating information from MC2 allowed areas to shift from one vegetation type to another with climate change, and also allowed us to incorporate trends in wildfire with climate change. And so then we ran the state and transition models and summarized the outcome in terms of rangeland condition and sage-grouse habitat. And we ran these models under several climate and management scenarios, which I will outline next. So for our climate change scenarios, we used three global circulation models, and we purposely chose three very different models with projections that sort of span the range of what we expect in the region. So first, the HAD-GEM model, which is the hottest and driest model in the group. The NOR-ESM model, which is hot with wetter conditions. And then the MRI model is warm, not as hot as the other two. So all of these three models project higher temperatures in all seasons, quite a bit higher in some of the hotter scenarios, and similar or higher annual precipitation. So in general, hotter and wetter, but varying in the degree and also in the seasonality of that change in precipitation. For our management scenarios, we ran a baseline no management scenario, assuming no restoration activities. And then a current management scenario where we worked with various agencies in the region to determine what treatments are currently happening, the types of treatments, and also what rates for each ownership type, and apply those into the future. And then a restoration management scenario, which is an alternative scenario where we increase the rates of treatment and in some cases change the types of treatment to try to better restore sage-grouse habitat. Okay, so I'm going to delve into some results here. First, we're going to look at potential vegetation types. So these are those broad vegetation categories. As you can see from the legend here, we have just a couple of types of forested vegetation types shown in gray, moist and dry forests. And then we're primarily interested in these shrub steppe vegetation types in the black line. So the solid black line is moist shrub steppe, and the dashed line dry shrub steppe, and then the dotted line is xeric shrub steppe. And this xeric shrub steppe is the vegetation type that we got out of that species distribution model that I mentioned, and it tracks areas that are hot and dry in the summer that, according to this model, were climatically unsuitable for sage-grouse. So these two, the moist and dry shrub steppe, are suitable for sage-grouse, and then of course the forested types are not habitat for sage-grouse, and then the xeric shrub steppe is also too hot and dry in the summer for sage-grouse, so those are considered unsuitable vegetation types. So I'm going to show 4 panels here of the different climate scenarios. All these projections for the first few slides are under no management, so just kind of a baseline scenario. So with current climate, there's no trend shown because we actually just assume that vegetation types stay constant into the future. So we're showing out to the end of the century on the y-axis, and then the area in each vegetation type on the x-axis, and then the area on the y-axis. So under each of our climate change scenarios, here's the hottest and driest scenario, and the warm scenario, and the hot and wet scenario. We can see that vegetation types are projected to change quite a bit over the next century. And there's quite a bit of variability, which you would expect because the climate models were quite different in their projections. But there are also some commonalities. So one commonality is that moist shrub steppe in the solid black line is increasing on all of those scenarios, and dry shrub steppe is declining. And this is largely due to the increase in precipitation that we're seeing in the climate change projections. We also see that forested types in gray are remaining relatively constant over time. And then there's a fair amount of variability in the xeric shrub steppe in the dotted lines. And that just depends on, each climate model is pretty different in terms of its summer conditions, how hot and dry those summer conditions get. And so quite a bit of variability there. Okay, next I'm showing vegetation composition. So this is the more detailed vegetation composition that we get from the state and transition models across all of our vegetation types. So we have in green the native shrub steppe, which is of course the most desirable state. And then in red, exotic shrub steppe, and there's 2 different sort of flavors of that. The solid red line is areas dominated by exotic shrub steppe or exotic grasses. And then the dashed red line is semi-degraded areas where there's still some remnant perennial native populations, but also some invasion. So it's kind of at risk for transitioning to exotic dominated. In the yellow, there's seeded shrub steppe, which is pretty minor in the landscape. And then in blue, we see juniper woodlands. The woodlands in the blue solid line, and then threshold woodlands, which are areas which kind of scattered juniper that are at risk of transitioning to full woodlands in the dashed blue line, and then forest in the gray. So under current climate, we can see that, first of all, the initial landscape starts out with a lot of semi-degraded shrub steppe. So that's really a state at risk of transitioning to exotic dominated, and that's what we see there. That solid red line increases. Native shrub steppe in green declines, and then juniper woodlands continue to expand, which is what we've been seeing across a lot of the landscape in recent decades. And then, so again, this exotic shrub steppe and woodland and forest are unsuitable for sage-grouse. And then so under our 3 climate change scenarios, under the hottest, driest scenario, here's what we see, the warm scenario and the hot and wet scenario. So in the first few decades of the simulations, things look fairly similar across all of the climate scenarios, and then later in the century they really diverge. So we actually see under the climate change scenarios, we see less exotic grass invasion, and this is because related to the last slide I showed, the areas are transitioning from dry shrub steppe to moist shrub steppe, which is more resilient to exotic grasses. So these areas are actually able to recover and resist invasion better. We see also better outcomes in terms of native shrub steppe, where it's sort of maintaining or increasing over time depending on the climate scenario. And then interestingly, in terms of juniper woodlands in the blue, under the climate change projections, since we're seeing more precipitation and a shift from dry to moist shrub steppe, we would expect to see more juniper woodlands, and there's more juniper woodland potential, but we're also seeing an increase in wildfire, and fire is keeping those woodlands at bay, so they actually are at lower levels across these climate change scenarios compared to the current climate scenario. So speaking of fire, this is just showing real quick, under current climate on the left bar, what we're seeing early, mid, and late century in terms of fire, a little bit of an increase due to exotic grasses, but not much. And then under the 3 climate change scenarios to the right of that, we see a 2- to 4-fold increase in fire. So quite a bit more fire at the end of the century under climate change. And again, that's related to the projections we saw with juniper, where we weren't seeing as much juniper under climate change because of all this fire. Okay, so now I'll look a little bit at management scenarios. And so this is kind of showing again what you've seen with exotic grass, but with the initial conditions on the left, and then end of century conditions on the right, shown for each of the climate change scenario, or the climate scenarios in the groups of bars, and then management scenarios. Whoops. Management scenarios are the different shades of gray and black. So for exotic grass, we can see there's a lot, in terms of late century projections, there's a lot of variability among the climate change scenarios, but those 3 bars are pretty similar that management is not having much of an effect, and it's really difficult to restore some of these areas. Conversely, with juniper, we actually see that management is fairly effective. There's not a whole lot of variation among the climate scenarios, but you do see that the difference between that black bar of no management and that light gray restoration management is pretty substantial. So management is really better able to keep juniper at bay. Okay, so one more thing I'll show you. So sort of bringing it all together in sage-grouse habitat. The legend is at the bottom there, and I don't know how easy it will be for you guys to read that. I apologize for the small font. But basically what I'm showing here is sage-grouse habitat over time, and in the black lines are sort of general habitat that includes some kind of marginal habitat states. And then in gray is high-quality habitat. And then the different types of line, no management is in the solid line, current management is in dashed, and then restoration management is in dotted. So under current climate, we do see declines in sage-grouse habitat, but we also see that management can have some effect in sort of buffering that and making the decline not quite as sharp. And then under our 3 climate change scenarios, a little bit of a different picture, what we were seeing with some of the other previous slides, some recovery from these undesirable state classes. So we see a little bit better outcomes, still declines in some cases, and under this really wet NOR-ESM model, actual recovery to pretty high levels over time. So some variation again among climate change scenarios, and also some potential for management to impact those outcomes. Okay, so really briefly, a few conclusions. In our study, climate change is likely to cause expansion of moist shrub steppe and increases in wildfire. The current landscape composition presents a high risk for expansion of exotic grasses and juniper. But actually, climate change was projected to reduce exotic grass and juniper relative to current climate, although they did both increase. And management was effective in controlling juniper, but not exotic grass. And sage-grouse habitat declined in the short term, but then did rebound late in the century under some of the climate change scenarios. And we did publish this work in a special issue of Ames Environmental Science that is all devoted to state and transition simulation modeling. And I'm also happy to, if you'd like to get in touch about these results, I'm happy to discuss them. Okay, so in summary, sort of bringing together all three of these talks. So we think that state and transition simulation models are a useful and flexible tool for conceptualizing vegetation dynamics and projecting future conditions. They've been used quite widely to inform management of ecosystems, and I think they will continue to be used quite a bit. They're useful for a wide variety of ecosystems because they're so flexible. And as we showed in these studies, although they haven't been historically used this way, they can be used to assess the impacts of climate change in various different ways. And they also allow us to incorporate data from multiple models and other sources. And so with that, thank you for your attention, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Megan, Brian, and Jen. We will open up the conference for questions. We had one come in from John Wilson, and it says, does the increased precipitation hotter scenario take into account ET rates?
So I believe that question is for me. Yes.
Yeah,
so
sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. It was about the sage-grouse one. So ET rates might be expected to increase and counter the increased precip. So I was just wondering if the scenarios took that potential into an account.
Yeah, so the MC2 model does take evapotranspiration into account. We set these, so that it is incorporated in there, but we also have to set thresholds in the model. It's a little complicated, but so our threshold was actually based solely on precipitation. And so actually, increases in evapotranspiration are taken into account in the model, but then not in our threshold for distinguishing the vegetation types. And that's actually something that we probably can improve with a finer tuned rule set.
Okay, and as a quick follow, just did you consider doing a decreased precip scenario?
Yeah, so we looked at what was it, 40 scenarios, I think, so a really large set of them. Almost all of them show increases in precipitation. So there were, and actually, so that the Hadley model was one of the driest, and it was just a little bit more moist overall, but it was drier in the summers. And there were just a few that were drier overall. And, since we had to pick three, we wanted to pick high-performing models and also sort of capture this cloud. So the Hadley model was the closest to decreased precipitation, but even it had increased precipitation. So really, yeah, the projections are for more precipitation overall.
Thanks.
And we have a question from Leela, and it says, is there any spatial output from any of these studies?
This is Jen. We initialized our landscape with spatial data, but we did not do spatial projections in this case.
Yeah, same with me. This is Megan for the Sage-grouse study, but I believe Brian has some spatial output.
Yep. So we did run the model spatially, and this included things like the sizes of fires and also distances for seed dispersal and things like that. So spatial dynamics were definitely a part of the model in that sense. We haven't looked too carefully at the spatial output because if we run it multiple different times, because of some the randomization in the model, you'll get some fairly different spatial results. That being said, we could probably come out with some sort of general conclusions regarding where whitebark might or might not be found on the landscape. So as sort of through time, and we can see this in the species distribution model work, you would expect that sort of suitable conditions are moving upslope as temperatures increase and things like that. sort of those higher elevations become more suitable for whitebark. But in terms of looking at, say, early cereal stage whitebark versus late cereal stage whitebark and how that's distributed on the landscape, we haven't looked at that as carefully yet, but yeah, it's certainly possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then along with more of the models, it says, if we have no experience doing this, how difficult is it? And is there a good reference for getting started, like State Transition Models 101?
Good question.
Sure.
Well, this is Megan. And in my experience, this is one of the more user-friendly models to use. We all use this STSM platform, and the company who sort of developed that product, Apex RMS, does do trainings a couple times a year, I think. And there's various resources available on their website as well. So I would say, there's certainly a learning curve, but it's not too bad. Jen and Brian might have some other thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I can actually copy and paste the web link to the Apex RMS website into the chat box for you to be able to click on. And yeah, just simply that the nice thing about that platform is it's a graphical user interface, so you don't need to learn a coding language necessarily in order to run it. And I think that's what makes the learning curve a little bit shallow, at least initially. But it does have a lot of flexibility and things that you can do with it. So it's easy to kind of get your feet wet, but allows for making more complex models as you get more comfortable.
Yeah, and I'll just add, this is Jen, that I'll agree with Megan and Brian that it's pretty user-friendly and that it has been used quite a bit in kind of working group meetings with stakeholders and that kind of thing. And so it is easy enough to use that you can kind of update some of these models on the fly, depending on the complexity and the whether you're running them spatially. It may not be as possible to do on the fly, but you can use this to kind of communicate and work with folks to update models and run them real time, even in some cases.
Yeah, and as Jen mentioned during her presentation, the landfire models are a great place to start if you want to start modeling some ecological system. You just need a template of, historical conditions with a fairly simple model, and you can sort of modify it from there. So there is a starting place.
Excellent. Thank you. We have a few more questions. One is for Brian, and it asks, can you explain a little bit more about the guts of the model, that complex diagram that you had showed, and where does SEM integrate with process modeling?
Sure. So let me go ahead and see if I can jump back to that slide that I believe Gregor is mentioning there, just to give a little bit of a visual of what I'm talking about. And so, yeah, this is one of the vegetation types. This is the whitebark pine vegetation type. We also have what we call strata, or you might call a potential vegetation type for spruce fir forest and also lodgepole forest, with their own sort of sets of states and transitions. I guess, and just to keep it sort of as brief as I can, but give you a little bit more meat. So this area in the upper left is essentially that 3-box and arrow diagram I showed before with seedling establishment. These green arrows are representing age-based sort of deterministic transitions through time, so you might think of as succession, to mid and late closed forest and mid-open and late open whitebark forest. And then over here we have sort of what you might think of as a blister rust module, so the infection of various state classes by that non-native fungal pathogen, white pine blister rust, and also sort of a mountain pine beetle kind of a module you might think of down here that's showing mountain pine beetle infection and spread, and also mortality events, both from rust and from pine beetle. And down here at the bottom we have a sort of a placeholder for areas that have burned from fire. And then what you can't see on this image, sort of these arrows going off into space here, are transitioning from dead forest to a shrub-herb state class or shrub-herb potential vegetation type that can then subsequently either sort of transition back to whitebark possibly, or transition to those other forest types, lodgepole pine or spruce fir forest.
Thank you.
Actually, I think there's a question that may have just been sent to me from Robert Shantz. It says, why is the moist shrub step increasing during the hot, dry climate scenario? Change from conifer to shrub. So as I mentioned, even the hot, dry climate scenario, it's drier in the summer, but it's actually more moist overall. And so there's a couple of things going into those projections. One is just the change in precipitation, where moisture is increasing, although it's not increasing a whole lot. So the other component that I didn't have time to get into is that we assume, so when we make these state and transition models climate sensitive, that we're basically drawing arrows between these ecological systems and allowing, transition from one to the other. And we're assuming that you can only get a climate-related shift following wildfire. Otherwise, they'd be jumping back and forth year to year. There wouldn't be any sort of inertia of the existing vegetation. And so because there's so much more fire, not only are we getting more precipitation causing that shift to the moist shrub step, but also these frequent fires are allowing opportunities to shift, for the vegetation type to shift. So it's sort of twofold. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. And we do have another sage-grouse question, and it's from David Wood. In accounting for sage-grouse habitat following wildfire or other disturbances, is there a lag effect until the sagebrush is tall enough to meet seasonal habitat requirements?
Yeah, good question. So one thing that we probably overestimate sagebrush habitat post-fire, and that's, I think, one of the big things. That's one of the things we mentioned in the paper. If we get really big fires where we're not getting sagebrush seeding back in, our model is not capturing that well. And actually, so we determined which state classes were suitable for sage-grouse based on basically overlaying our maps of current state class distribution with known locations of sage-grouse. And some of those locations were LECs. And so we think we're actually probably overestimating the habitat value of some of those more open areas, and that, as you point out, some shrubs are going to have to come in and reach a certain height and sort of successional stage to really provide quality habitat, at least for some life stages. So, we really sort of paint a broad brush of, that's one thing about sage-grouse is they have these different requirements in different seasons. And so we're kind of glossing over all of that. So it's a very broad picture view, and we don't really get to that level of detail. And some spatial modeling would probably help with that. And so some of it is sort of our rule set and how general it is, and some of it is that we're not modeling these fire events spatially and accounting for that seeding of sagebrush back in. So some of our habitat projections are a little bit optimistic in that way.
Brian forwarded me one from Wendy Ledbetter asking, was our model able to take into account that with increased temperatures, natural disturbances, including wind events, hurricanes and tornadoes, could impact forest stands with increased fuel loading, and in some instances hazardous fuels. So thinking about interactions among fire and other disturbances, and then sort of the impact of fire effects and safety and frequency for safety as well. So unfortunately, we didn't take into account some of these interactions, and that's a good point that, with increasing, especially hurricanes, there might be even more potential for more wildfires and more severe effects of the wildfires in the future. So that was something that we weren't able to take into account. Another thing along those lines is changes in the ability to conduct some of these management actions like prescribed burning as urbanization takes place. So maybe with the increases in the wildland-urban interface, you might have more safety issues and constraints on burning, and that's another thing that we didn't take into account, which would be great to account for. So future work on that.
And then I just had one more question come in to me from Robert Shantz. His question was, it seems like whitebark pine should be increasing over time, all things being equal, due to climate-induced reductions in subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, current distribution might be confounding the climate envelope model. So I guess I'll just add, I focused in there on whitebark pine in terms of bringing in the species distribution models of whitebark. We also did the same thing for both lodgepole forest and spruce fir forest. That was the modeling work done by Nathan Backellick at Penn State, to sort of also have the ability of spruce fir and lodgepole establishment be dictated by their own sort of climate envelope models. So that was one piece of it. And I think that sort of the interesting thing about what you're pointing out here is that they kind of have a complex sort of intersection of a variety of dynamics. And so although we may expect spruce fir areas to decline due to climate, there's also some opportunities that are presented because, for one thing, it's shade-tolerant species, as you may realize, and so over time it can replace whitebark stands. And also, as whitebark stands are being impacted by mountain pine beetle and blister rust, that also has some additional opportunities for spruce fir and Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce to sort of establish or spread across the landscape. So I hope that gets it. Question.
All right, and we have time for one more question. It's from Nancy Green, and it is for Megan, and it says, does your paper acknowledge the possibility that local populations of sage-grouse could be extricated before conditions or rebound in the future, that the habitat may rebound, but the species might no longer be there to use it? Excuse me.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, we make it very clear that we're not doing any sort of sage-grouse population modeling. It's all vegetation modeling. So I don't know that we mentioned that specifically, but that is true, and we definitely don't take that into account any of the demographic stuff. So yeah, hopefully sage-grouse won't be in that bad of shape that quickly, but that is a good point.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, Jen, Megan. It was an excellent presentation, and I think that was a wonderful discussion afterwards, so thank you very much.
Well, thanks again to
Yeah, thanks a lot.
all the listeners.
And then, Sean or Holly, did you have any closing remarks?
Nope, thank you very much for the presentations, and really enjoyed the question and answer session as well. So great job, guys.
And thank you to the participants.